So, the reason I came here today is to talk to you about the BeAPI framework. It's pronounced BeAPI like the Europeans do. My name's Owen Rubel. I'm an original member of Amazon, 95 to 98. Yeah, I'm that old. I was a speaker at Spring One from 2014 2015, and I just got back from API World where I spoke on the new API pattern. The API pattern, if none of you know, it was actually invented in the 1970s. And it was bound to the business logic. The communication is bound to the business logic. When I was working at Apple and Cisco, I found this out, and I realized when we were working in distributed architectures, which is basically what we do these days. We work in distributed architectures, no longer in centralized architectures. We have a proxy, we have a message queue, so on and so forth. That binding creates an architectural cross-cutting concern where we can't share the I/O. The request and the response meet at the API application. And that's where the single version of truth actually is, and that's where the data is bound. So when we actually make a call to the proxy can't actually get that data, not with actually duplicating that data. And if we duplicate that data, it can't be shared. It can't be synchronized. So I realized this a long time ago. I realized this when I was working on a Cisco and Apple contract, and I was like, this causes drop threads. This causes the data so that it can't be synchronized. This causes so many issues that why has nobody thought of this? I mean, why has Google not thought of this? Why has Amazon not thought of this? And I talked to people, and the true fact is that nobody thought of this. And I started reworking it. I started redesigning the frameworks, and I started working in Spring Boot to do this. How many people know what Spring Boot is? Nobody out there. Oh, I have one person. So Spring Boot is a microservice. Everybody knows what a microservice is, right? I see a couple heads shaking. Okay, so this here, whoops, let me take off the card. This here is a microserver. The software on this is a microservice. That's what you're actually getting all your calls, surfing the web, getting maps through, so on and so forth. A microservice is basically software that is focused on one specific thing. Not like a big, giant, monolithic application on your server. By focusing on a microservice and rewriting the API framework, we can get, for distributed architectures, we can get faster speeds, we can reduce the amount of code we need, and by synchronizing that I/O across the distributed architectures, we can make it so that it's easier to scale. It shares the I/O in the architecture, we can resync it without taking the server down, and we can abstract the communication layer away from the business logic. This is extremely crucial because by abstracting that communication, we can automate testing, we can automate batching, we can automate chaining, and this is a really, really big thing. How many of you have had to make an API call where you make one API call to get data back and then use that data to make another API call, get that data back, make another API call to get the actual data that you need? Okay, now I see some hands. Excellent. Well, that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. You just made 3 requests and 3 responses to get the actual data that you need. What you should be doing, if you properly abstract the API communication away from the business logic, is chain all 3 of those requests together into one. Make one request, get that response back. That's one request and one response as a chain called API chaining. And you can do that if you have proper proper abstraction of the communication away. I'll speed this up a little. And through that, you can actually bind all of the tooling that you actually have to add on to it as well. CQRS, API docs, role checking, API chaining, batch automation, all of this functionality, you don't have to add on as tooling. It's just built in automatically. But don't take my word for it. This is what a few people said about this. When I presented this to Netflix, the API manager said, and I quote, This fixes everything that we're having problems with. He even said, have you been looking at our code? I said, no, I don't need to look at your code. I said, everybody has this exact same issue. I said, Google, Amazon, they're all the same. When I tested this out on a 1.8 gigahertz with two cores and 1 gigabyte of RAM, I get 100,000 requests on a full framework that's checking all the data with security, everything, in 32 seconds. It's a full framework.
Boop, boop.
Okay.
5 minutes goes fast.
Oh, yeah, it does. That's okay. It was only 2 more slides. Yes?
How does this compare to hypermedia,
Helios.
an application state, JSON-LD, that kind of stuff?
In what sense?
Like, what are you trying to supersede that? Is that essentially what you're doing?
No, API
But
abstraction.
wait, please repeat the question in the microphone.
Oh, what was the question?
The question is, how does your approach compare to Helios hypermedia approaches?
Well,
JSON-LD.
Helios is a binding. It binds and maps all of the URL mapping. You don't need that. It's useless. Well, think of it this way. Why should I create hard-coded bindings when I can actually create a binding for anything on the fly? It's automation. Why do I need to hard code bindings when I can create, when the end user can look at the API docs and say, I see how this relates to this, and this relates to this, and this relates to this. I'm just going to write the URL mapping and go, connect this to this to this to this, like Legos, and send. You don't need Helios anymore. See, Helios is a hard-coded binding saying you can call this and this and this, and that's it.
I guess I didn't have that narrow.
Well, that's the way an API chain works. I talked to this over with Mike Amundsen, and that's basically how it works. Any other questions? Yes?
Just to bring this down to layman's terms, so is BeAPI similar to the ASP.NET MVC initiative on how they are consolidating their technology to whittle down the data layering?
Well, ASP.NET MVC is not a microservice. That is a monolithic service. This is a plugin for Spring Boot, which is a microservice in which it takes care of all the API functionality for you.
Different business models, same, I'm curious about the method. It sounds like a similar methodology.
Not quite, because it takes care of CQRS, API docs, and API abstraction as well. Because even within ASP.NET MVC, you're still going to have the API bound to the business logic. This separates the communication from the business logic so that you can share the I/O state across your entire architecture. Even with ASP.NET, you're still going to have a problem sharing that I/O state. The proxy is not going to be able to see any of the data that's bound to your controller still. No, absolutely not. Any endpoint that you create it's infinite possibilities.
Okay. Thank you, Owen.
Oh, there's one more.
Okay, one more.
Oh, BeAPI.io. Yes.